Professor Michael Scott is Director of the Centre for Problem-Oriented Policing and a clinical professor at the University of Wisconsin Law School in the US. He started his career in policing. He was formerly Chief of Police in Lauderhill, Florida. He served in various civilian administrative positions in the St. Louis Metropolitan, Fort Pierce, Florida, and New York City police departments, and was a police officer in the Madison, Wisconsin Police Department. Michael developed training programs in problem-oriented policing at the Police Executive Research Forum and is a current chairperson for the Herman Goldstein Award for Excellence in Problem-Oriented Policing. I'm very much looking forward to his presentation this morning. Please welcome Professor Michael Scott. That's fresh water, Michael.
Good morning. So I'll begin with a poem. To a mouse. But mousie, thou or know thy lane, improving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes of mice and men gang aft to glay, and lee us naught but grief and pain for promised joy. For those of you not familiar with the poetry of Robert Burns, allow me to translate from Scots English to American English. I'll leave you to translate to Australian English. Talking to a mouse, the poet tells him that, like mice, men also have difficulty turning their grand plans into reality. And that sucks. That's not quite as eloquent as Burns, but that's basically what he's saying. Now, I don't think that Sir Robert Burns had in mind crime prevention planning when he wrote this, but nonetheless, it's apt. And most of my professional work has been devoted to promoting better policing, to include better crime prevention through the framework of problem-oriented policing, a concept which is undoubtedly familiar to many of you, though perhaps not to all. And without trying to give a thorough explanation of problem-oriented policing here, the concept heavily emphasizes a deliberate planning and analysis process as being useful to achieving policing objectives. A variety of these so-called problem-solving processes have been developed for problem-oriented policing, going by their supposedly easy-to-remember acronyms: CAPRA, Partners, Proctor, the 5 I's, and the most widely recognized of them, the SARA model, standing for Scanning, Analysis, Response, and Assessment. By whatever label, these processes remind problem solvers to ask the following sorts of questions. What is the nature and scope of the problem? What sort and degree of harm is it causing, and to whom? Who wants what done about the problem? What is causing the problem, or causing it to be as bad as it is? What is currently being done about the problem, and to what effect? What else might be done about the problem, and what from among these possibilities should actually be done? And then who is responsible for doing these new things, and how can they be persuaded to do them? And if and when these new things are done, what impact do they have on the problem? Are things better, the same, or worse than before? Much has been studied and written about the various phases of the problem-solving processes. Using the SARA framework, the scanning phase, or identifying and defining public safety problems. There is information that has been written about that phase of the process, and I'm currently working with a colleague on writing a short guide for police on this aspect of problem solving. The analysis phase, much has been written about understanding what causes or contributes to crime problems and how we go about figuring that out. And in the assessment phase, much has been written about evaluating or measuring the impact of problem-solving efforts on the problem. But considerably less attention has been paid to this middle phase, the response or the implementation phase. Compared to scanning, analysis, and assessment, response seems deceptively simple and straightforward. Indeed, sometimes we think all the advice we ever needed was provided to us by Nike. Just do it. If only it were so, but wishing it were so or believing it were so won't make it so. Now, it does turn out that some attention has been paid to this aspect of problem solving. Indeed, the reason I was invited to speak to you is that Rick Brown, the Deputy Research Director at AIC, and I co-authored a guide for police on implementing responses to problems. And I have brought along some copies of this guide which are available in the resource room. But let's think a bit about why some of our crime prevention initiatives fail, or in Burns's words, why our best laid schemes go aft gley. There are four basic reasons why crime prevention initiatives can fail. The first is that the problem was inaccurately identified. What we thought to be the problem turned out not to be the problem at all. So we tried to solve the wrong problem, or worse, something that wasn't really a problem at all. By way of example, many efforts to address the problem of sexual assault emphasize responses that seek to prevent violent rapes by strangers. So improving lighting in public places, identifying and monitoring known rapists in the community, providing safe transportation for women at nighttime, teaching women self-defense techniques, and so forth. And while that problem is, of course, real and very serious, the far more common sexual assault is that which is committed by acquaintances of the victims. And most of the responses to violent stranger rapes won't have much impact on acquaintance rapes, which is a quite different problem in many important respects. The second basic reason why crime prevention initiatives fail is that the problem was inadequately analyzed. More precisely, the causes and contributing factors to the problem were not accurately understood. For example, efforts to reduce fights in and around licensed liquor establishments by arresting the combatants are highly likely to fail. For problems like these, where there is a steady stream of new potential offenders, changing the environment of the licensed establishment is the better course of action, because a substantial amount of research demonstrates that patrons take their cues about whether fighting in and around the establishment is tolerated from the environment and the rules of the establishment, not from fear of police arrest. The fourth reason crime prevention initiatives can fail is that the response simply didn't work. Even though the problem was correctly identified, the causes analyzed and understood, and the response plan was implemented faithfully. Some good ideas just don't work. I think a good example is drug abuse education programs for teenagers. When programs such as DARE were first developed in the United States in the mid-1980s, they did address a real problem: entry-level drug use by young people that could lead to their using harder drugs and becoming involved in crime that accompanies illegal drug markets. The analysis of the problem led to the reasonable conclusion that among the reasons young people started using illegal drugs was that they didn't understand the consequences and they didn't have the skills to say no in the face of peer pressure. And so the DARE curriculum was developed, standardized, and taught by police with great zeal to millions of young American students. But nearly all of the many impact evaluations of DARE have concluded that whatever other virtues DARE might enjoy, apparently reducing future drug use by students isn't one of them. Of course, DARE and similar programs remain tremendously popular and alive and well, but I suspect this is because the programs are meeting objectives other than reducing drug use, perhaps job security for DARE instructors. Now, I didn't lose count or lose a page of my notes here. I skipped over the third reason that crime prevention initiatives can fail, because this is the one that I want to spend the balance of my time discussing. Crime prevention initiatives can fail because they weren't properly implemented or weren't implemented at all. Usually, as we American football fans say, somebody dropped the ball. Well, maybe this is a better... My limited knowledge of Australian rules football is that this guy is deliberately dropping the ball in order to kick it here. I can't figure out why, but... Now, I can't say this with any scientific certainty, but in my experience, this third reason for failure is much more common than one might imagine. We don't often read about these failures to implement. After all, who would bother to write a report about what didn't happen? But we do experience them, at least I know I have. Now, perhaps in our zeal to entice police to embrace a more deliberate analytical process for addressing their work, we oversimplified the problem-solving model, especially the deceptively simple SARA model. Within its response phase are actually three separate but interconnected steps. The first being developing a range of possible alternatives. The second being choosing from among those alternatives, and only the third being actually implementing the chosen responses. To which we could easily add a fourth, modifying the plan if and when the implementation doesn't seem to be going as planned, as is often the case. There are many factors that influence whether crime prevention initiatives are or are not successfully implemented, and one can't plan for every contingency. But I'd like to talk about 6 factors that I think are particularly important. I chose 6 because apparently that's one less than the maximum number of items that humans can readily memorize, and I've alliterated them here to further help you remember them. So I will call them prerequisites of positive performance. They are proprietorship, persistence, patience, persuasion, problem orientation, and practicality. I'll tell you a few of my own personal experiences with successful and failed implementation to illustrate these essential elements. By proprietorship, I mean ownership, and by ownership, I mean leadership. The precise term matters little, but the concept matters a lot. Successful implementation of crime prevention initiatives requires strong leadership to make sure that what is supposed to get done does get done. And leadership very often follows from a sense of ownership of an initiative, a true sense of commitment to that initiative because one has a personal investment in it. And where should that leadership come from? It need not come from the top of an organization. In fact, it rarely comes from there. Chief executives are usually far too consumed with other matters to lead any but the largest initiatives. In so many successful crime prevention initiatives, the leadership comes from far closer to the operating level. A couple of years ago, I was having lunch with a former violent crimes police detective who had recently been promoted to lieutenant and been assigned to what must have seemed like purgatory to him, the police department's training division. His personal passion remained in working on violent crime cases and catching bad guys. So we got talking over lunch about better ways to catch bad guys and better ways to deal with them once they were caught so as to get them to stop doing bad things. To make a long story short, I enticed him to think about policing the worst offenders, the most violent, the most prolific, in a very different way. And he got hooked enough on the idea of rethinking this to read more about it himself and to truly educate himself on a different approach. Now, maybe he just saw this as his ticket back to criminal investigations. But either way, with some further assistance from me and a few of my law students, this lieutenant developed a solid proposal to try out a radically new concept. He persuaded his superiors in the police department of its merit, and he even, of course, managed to get himself transferred and put in charge of a new police unit that would coordinate this approach. And although I might have sown some of the seeds for this new approach, by the time the lieutenant was pitching the idea, to his superiors, there was no doubt that he owned this initiative. This was his baby. And what he has accomplished to date is remarkable. He has enlisted the active support of several dozen law enforcement and social service agencies, persuaded judges, no easy matter, and has his program up and running to great acclaim, all within about a year and a half, which is light speed for an initiative of this magnitude. Now, interestingly, the same police lieutenant again recently met with me to pitch his latest idea for extending his focused deterrence concept to a wholly new policing problem, that of drunken driving. And as he enthusiastically began working out the details for this new initiative, I asked him whether his team of detectives would be the ones responsible for monitoring the drunk drivers. No, he said, that would most likely fall to the police department's traffic team. Now, what might be the problem here? No doubt some of your instincts are like mine, wondering how enthusiastic the traffic team will be to implement an idea developed by members of another unit and given to them. So I strongly suggested to the lieutenant that he involve members of the traffic team in the early conceptualization and design of this initiative, which he's now doing. The main point here is that a sense of ownership of an idea goes a long way toward ensuring faithful implementation of that idea. For the same reason that very few people take a rental car to the car wash and few people paint a house that they're leasing, few people are as committed to someone else's idea as they are committed to their own. So ownership need not mean total control of the project, but it should mean that those who are tasked with implementing the project have some involvement in its design in order to maximize their commitment to it. A decidedly less successful initiative involved a police detective in Florida with whom I worked. This detective, having newly been encouraged to think about his work in a more proactive and preventive fashion, asked me to help him find the resources to purchase an expensive piece of medical equipment that could improve the quality of investigations of sexual abuse of children. At the time, I was in charge of the police department's finances, but I knew that we lacked the money to buy the equipment outright. So I asked our police chief to call the head of another government agency to see if his agency might contribute funds toward the purchase of this equipment. The chief agreed to do so, but one day when the chief's phone call was returned while we were sitting in another meeting, my heart sank when the chief told his secretary to tell the head of that other agency that the chief was busy, but that the purpose of his call wasn't all that important anyway. So the request for funding was not made, the money was not procured, the equipment was not purchased, the investigations were not improved, and the status quo prevailed. And for years I saw this as a failure of the police chief's leadership, which perhaps it was, but upon greater reflection, the failure was at least partly my own, and maybe partly the detectives. It's not that we failed to recognize a genuine problem. It's not that we failed to analyze the problem and recognize an appropriate solution. We failed to build and make the case that might have persuaded others, our own police chief included, that this was truly important and worth the cost to acquire it. And the costs weren't just the cost of the equipment. Only when years later I became a police chief myself did I come to appreciate that what I really was asking of my police chief back then was that he spend some of his political capital, a precious commodity for a police chief. And for that, the detective and I were not persistent, passionate, and persuasive enough. The leadership necessary to see this initiative through to fruition was lacking. Now, the less sexy dimension of proprietorship and leadership is management, where leadership involves vision, authority, the power of persuasion. Management involves attending to the details, scheduling, funding, reporting, prodding, assigning, reassigning, adapting to exigencies, In short, keeping things on track and moving ahead. Inertia kills projects as surely as anything else can. Ideally, the project leader is also a good manager, but such is not always the case. Many chief executives who are good leaders are not especially good managers. They lack either the skills or the time to attend to details. However they're combined, both leadership and management are absolutely essential to success. Closely related to proprietorship is persistence. Many of the successful crime prevention initiatives with which I am familiar have been led by people who have the persistence of a bulldog. They are guerrilla warriors. They are determined to achieve their objective by whatever means. Quite often, the reason this quality is so critical with respect to crime prevention is that much crime prevention necessitates a departure from the status quo. This means almost invariably that someone is not going to welcome the proposed new way of doing business. After all, if the old way of doing business was satisfactory, there likely wouldn't be a problem to solve. The core reason why people, all of us, resist change is that we don't always know ahead of time how we personally and our personal interests will shake out in the new order of things. We might come out ahead, but we might come out behind, and that uncertainty leads most of us to conclude that the safer course of action is to maintain the status quo. To overcome such natural resistance, one must be persistent, patient, and persuasive. So I've now said that both persistence and patience are crucial to successful crime prevention implementation, and I appreciate that that might sound like a contradiction in terms. What I really mean by patience is awaiting the right opportunity to put a plan into action. And that right opportunity isn't always right after the plan has been hatched. A couple of anecdotes will help make this point. Some years ago, I was working as a research consultant to the police in a city in Georgia in the southern part of the United States. The project was funded by the federal government and was intended to help police apply the advice provided in the problem-oriented guides for police that I had helped to develop to real crime problems that were being experienced in that community. At the time, we had only produced about 20 of these problem-oriented guides, so the participating police agencies had to select problems to address from among these 20 topics. This police department chose to work on the problem of residential burglary, for which there was a POP guide. Now, because this project was funded by the federal government, work on the project needed to adhere to the federal government's timeline, its fiscal calendar. And with my help to push things along, we actually managed to do a pretty good job collecting information and analyzing the problem. And out of that analysis, we came up with what I still think was a pretty good burglary prevention implementation plan, involving plans to improve police reporting of burglaries, improve collection of evidence at burglary scenes, reduce false reports of burglary, improve burglary prevention advice provided to victims, improve the apprehension of prolific burglars, reduce school truancy to control daytime burglaries, better control the market for stolen goods, and improve the design of some neighborhoods to deter burglary. We really did learn a lot about the problem that we didn't know, and over a decade later, I'm still pretty pleased with our plan. But in the midst of our project, September of 2001, the police department's attention became drawn to other concerns. The terrorist attacks in New York and Washington, a local anthrax scare, and a proposed merger of the police department with another department understandably made residential burglaries seem rather less urgent. So by the time I had to close the project and submit my report to the federal government, little to nothing of the burglary plan had been put into action. There were both problems of ownership here. The police saw this more as my research project than their crime prevention project, and timing problems. The problem simply lost out to more urgent problems. But my next anecdote about the role of patience and opportunity is, I swear, purely coincidental. As I was writing down the Georgia burglary story I just told you for this talk, I got a phone call from a police chief who said that he was suddenly getting some significant pressure from his city's mayor about homeless people creating nuisances in the city center. And the chief felt the need to have a plan to respond to the mayor's concerns. And that needed to be done quickly. Fortunately, some of my law students had collaborated with some of the police chief's officers just a few years back in studying this very problem, a few elements of which had been implemented. Smelling a ripe opportunity, I wiped the virtual dust off of those now 4-year-old plans and put them back in the chief's hands within the hour. Like the Georgia burglary project, I had been somewhat disappointed that our plan to address chronic nuisance offenders had fallen by the wayside 4 years ago when key police officials working on the project were promoted and transferred. Now, it remains to be seen whether my patience and my good filing system will be rewarded with implementation of the plan, but the prospects have suddenly brightened. Oh, and by the way, when the idea for the drunken driving initiative that I mentioned earlier surfaced, I literally pulled off of my shelf a study of drunken driving and a recommended plan of action prepared for that very problem in that very same city that included the very same proposal to deal with chronic drunken drivers that I had worked on and which was completed and submitted to that police department in 1981, over 30 years ago. The plan was even written on a typewriter. That's how old it was. And yet, upon rereading that plan, it seemed as fresh and relevant as the day it was written. It was just a plan waiting patiently for its opportunity. Because it is often the case that the individual or agency spearheading the crime prevention initiative does not have the authority or resources to implement the proposed responses to the problem, some persuasion of others to do so will be necessary. What I want to focus on here is not the form of persuasion that derives from direct authority, do it or else, or the form derived from a compelling personality, or even the form derived from reciprocal deal-making, but rather the form of persuasion that comes from the power of evidence. I will be leading a more extensive workshop on this subject the day after tomorrow at the university, so I won't go into great detail here, but just sketch the outlines. Police, of course, are very accustomed to gathering and presenting evidence, but usually in the context of building a criminal case. The sort of evidence required to persuade others to implement crime prevention measures is different. It is firstly evidence that the crime problem being addressed is serious and demands attention. It is secondly evidence that the current response to the problem is inadequate. It is thirdly evidence of what is causing the problem. It is fourthly evidence that the proposed new response to the problem is likely to be effective. And it is fifthly evidence, or at least a compelling argument, that this individual or this organization should be responsible for implementing the new response. Again, none of these forms of evidence are the sort that police agencies are accustomed to presenting, but they are becoming increasingly important to successful policing and crime prevention. The basic argument here is that too often the public expects crime problems to be dealt with by the police through either their physical presence or their powers of arrest. And while those remain important tools for police, they seldom have the sort of crime prevention effect we hope for because they do little to address the underlying conditions to crime problems. Let me use a local example that I read about in a crime journal. It involves so-called ram raiding at shopping malls here in the greater Sydney area. I wasn't familiar with the term when I first read it, so I had to look it up. But apparently ram raiding involves thieves crashing their vehicles into the shopping mall and using the vehicle to rip out the ATM in the mall in order to steal the cash inside. The problem was of concern both to the public police and to the private corporations that owned the shopping centers and the ATMs. The corporations likely would have preferred a new response that enabled police to arrive quicker to the scene to apprehend the thieves. That would involve some added costs to the police and consequently to the taxpayers. On the other hand, police would likely prefer that the corporations better secure the ATMs or the shopping center so that the crime was harder to successfully commit. That would involve some added cost to the corporations. Well, whose argument would be more persuasive to the other? The New South Wales Police organized a task force to address the problem. The task force's work included mounting some of the sort of evidence I just mentioned. It presented evidence of the scope and seriousness of the problem. There were 69 of these crimes in 1 year across the jurisdiction with significant financial losses. Just determining the number of ram raids took considerable effort because police records classified this crime in different ways. The task force presented evidence that the current responses to the problem were not especially effective. Having police respond quickly to apprehend the thieves wasn't effective given the time gap between how long it took thieves to commit the crime and how long it took police to be notified and to arrive. The existing alarms, surveillance cameras, traffic bollards, and the hardware that secured the ATMs to the walls and the floors were also proving inadequate. And the detailed analysis of successful and unsuccessful ram raids provided evidence about what sorts of new responses might better prevent the crimes. It turned out that placing ATMs where vehicles wouldn't fit and installing barriers right next to the ATMs, in conjunction with the alarms, were effective responses. All this evidence pointed the way toward a combination of new responses, the costs for which were apportioned between the police and the corporations. An evaluation of the initiative provided the final form of evidence. It revealed a 72% reduction in attempted ram raids and a 93% reduction in successful ones. The missing evidence, which is admittedly hard to derive, is that which would demonstrate which of the various responses implemented had the greatest positive effect. This initiative is somewhat unusual in that police and the private corporations appear to have worked well together, and that they came to mutual agreement as to who would do what to address the problem, with costs and labor being divided equitably. Again, by coincidence, it turns out that the person taking the lead on the project on behalf of the private corporations is a former police officer with whom I used to work in New York City and currently working here in Sydney for the Westfield Corporation. And his experiences in public policing and private security might well have bridged a communications and trust gap that is often hard to bridge. If I'm not mistaken, he's also standing at the back of the room. Where communications and trust is lacking between those promoting the crime prevention measure and those with the capacity to implement it, other methods of persuasion might be called for. This is what I'll be talking about more on Wednesday, but this graphic represents a framework for how police, and by extension, other crime prevention practitioners, might employ various methods for shifting responsibility for crime prevention to those we might call reluctant partners. For those of you interested, but who cannot attend the Wednesday workshop, there is a guidebook written for police available on this topic. Crime prevention initiatives should be launched in order to solve some particular problem. They should not be launched to prevent crime in general. If we've learned nothing else about crime, we've learned that it is not a monolithic thing. The only sure common denominator among all crimes is that some legislature has deemed that conduct punishable by incarceration. But no more than one can prevent all illness with one health measure, can one prevent all crime with one crime prevention measure. The response to a crime problem must be carefully tailored to the particular type of crime. But more than that, it must be carefully tailored to the particular setting in which that crime problem is occurring. Just because a particular crime prevention measure is known to have been effective in some other place does not mean that it will be equally effective in your place. Context matters. We've seen this tendency all too often in the United States. A successful crime prevention measure developed in one jurisdiction gets favorable national media coverage or favorable coverage within the crime prevention community, and other jurisdictions across the country feel compelled to adopt it blindly, without first analyzing their own local problem to determine if they even experience the same problem as the original jurisdiction. Now, a problem orientation also contrasts with a response orientation. The underlying crime problem should drive the initiative, not the preferred response. The Neighborhood Watch movement is a classic example of a crime prevention measure in search of crime problems. At least in the United States, some police agencies assign police officers full-time just to organize and support Neighborhood Watch programs, notwithstanding that much of the research on them tells us that they are notoriously hard to sustain in the absence of acute neighborhood crime problems, especially in impoverished neighborhoods that commonly lack the natural social cohesion that would both sustain a neighborhood watch, but which, if it existed, would also prevent much crime in the first instance. So the net effect is that Neighborhood Watch tends to thrive where it's not needed and tends not to thrive where it is needed. Neighborhood Watch, like drug abuse resistance education, gang resistance education, street lighting, CCTV surveillance, and other popular crime prevention programs, might well be sensible responses to some crime problems, but not to all crime problems, and seldom as standalone responses. The most effective crime prevention is that which is tailored to specific problems and which is multidimensional, with one measure reinforcing others. My organization, the Center for Problem-Oriented Policing, has created a series of guidebooks on how some crime prevention responses work and how to implement them, but all of them say that the problem should drive the response, not the other way around. Similarly, a problem orientation stands in contrast to a partner orientation. Crime prevention partnerships are usually good things, but again, the orientation should be to the problem, not to the partnership. I've been having a bit of a running debate these past few years with some of our British police and crime prevention colleagues. A while back, the British police and crime prevention practitioners opted to rename problem-oriented policing problem-oriented partnerships. And they built some of their crime prevention legislation around the notion of partnerships. And thus, crime prevention partnerships have sprung up all over the UK, which in some respects is to be envied, because police most certainly can use the assistance of partners. But however well-intended, the partnership should never become the goal. The prevention of particular crime problems should remain the goal. If a partnership is required or helpful to prevent or control a problem, it should be organized and administered, but not all crime problems require elaborate partnerships. Moreover, once a particular crime problem is resolved, it's not such a bad thing for the partnership to dissolve, so long as it or a different partnership can be reconstituted if the need arises. Prematurely constituted partnerships or standing partnerships can be complicated by virtue of the fact that they often feel compelled to find a role and an equal voice for each partner, neither of which might make sense in the context of a particular problem. Let the problem determine the need for and the contours of a partnership, not the other way around. Lastly, the more practical the response plan, the more likely it is to be implemented. By practical, I mean several things. One, that the resources needed to implement a response are available at the time the plan is devised. Obviously, that isn't always possible. Indeed, in many instances, if the resources for a particular response were available, the response might already be in place. Among the most critical resources are the authority to implement the response, the know-how, skills, and time to implement the response, and the money to purchase supplies or pay someone else to implement the response. If you personally lack the authority to execute the response, do you know how to obtain that authority? If it will require a new law or a change in policy, obviously that will take some time and effort to realize, but it can be done. I know of a good number of American police officers who succeeded in getting local, state, and even federal laws changed so that they had the authority to implement a new crime prevention response. In one example, a university police officer was able to get local law changed to require secondhand bookstores to keep a record of the identity of all people selling textbooks. This simple change in the law virtually eliminated textbook thieves' opportunity to sell stolen textbooks easily and yielded a 90% reduction in reported textbook thefts on that campus. As a side note, but one that reinforces the importance of practicality, the police officer who developed this idea agreed that the law should exempt bookstores that did not routinely purchase textbooks and eliminated the requirement that police departments routinely inspect these records. That concession made the law much more practical and alleviated the opposition that both the booksellers and the police department was mounting to his original proposal. With respect to know-how, skills, and time, when people are asked to take on new tasks that they already know how to do and which they can reasonably accomplish within their regular work routine, they are far more likely to perform them faithfully. Try not to ask individuals and organizations to do things they don't ordinarily do. And with respect to money, where possible, try to establish or find a pool of somewhat unrestricted funds that can be spent on a variety of crime prevention activities. Crime prevention planning doesn't always sync up with organizational annual budgeting cycles. Effective crime prevention of the sort we're discussing today, that is tailored to needs that are determined on the basis of careful analysis and that is problem-oriented, calls for a more flexible funding arrangement than is usually offered by annual budgets and government grants. In some U.S. jurisdictions, privately run police foundations have been created through which corporate donations in support of public safety can be drawn upon by police on an as-needed basis, with oversight and accounting of the funds handled by an independent organization. Alternatively, many U.S. police departments accumulate funds through the seizure and forfeiture of illegal assets, mainly drug money, and for the most part, these funds can only be used for law enforcement purposes, which can include crime prevention. In conclusion, with all of these obstacles to implementing new responses to crime problems, it's a wonder that anything ever gets accomplished, and yet it does. Perhaps not always according to plan, but effective responses do get put into place. On the Center for Problem-Oriented Policing website, we continue to gather hundreds of examples of effective crime reduction and prevention, some led by police, some by others. In nearly every one of them, each initiative is written down and put out for others to read, and some degree of success was usually realized. And yet, in nearly every one of these reports is some discussion of the obstacles that had to be overcome to implement the plan. The lessons of proprietorship, persistence, patience, persuasion, problem orientation, and practicality are gleaned from these real-world experiences. So I'll leave you with two last thoughts from others who gave serious and not so serious thought to implementing plans, both of which seem applicable to our work. Said General Eisenhower, "In preparing for battle, I have always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable." It's in developing the plan that we are compelled to give serious thought to why we want to take certain actions and to better prepare ourselves to adapt to the as yet unknown contingencies that lie ahead. And lastly, because I started with a mouse, I'll finish with a mouse. The British author Saki wrote, "In baiting a mousetrap with cheese, always leave room for the mouse." Because no matter how much technology might be involved, crime prevention is mostly about human behavior, so it's worth reminding ourselves that even more so than for a mouse, the human factor is hard to anticipate. And that's not mere speculation, You can plan on it. Thank you.